SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Good morning, dear students. Welcome to my class. This is lecture number 22. In this lecture, we will be discussing the major tribal uprisings and peasant movements broke out in India from 1757 to 1857. Whether there was any peasant and tribal uprisings during the period of the Mughals or in the territory of the Peshwas. Shall we start with this? No doubt, even during the period of the Mughals and the Peshwas administration in Western India, peasant movements broke out during 18th and 19th centuries. The reason was that high land revenue demand by the state, corruption and harsh attitude of the revenue collectors. These were the reasons behind the outbreak of the peasant movements during the period of the Mughals as well as the administration of the Peshwas in Maratha country in Western India. Likewise, peasant and tribal uprisings broke out against the British as well, with the establishment of their administration in India by the mid 18th century. What were the reasons behind the outbreak of the peasant and tribal uprisings? First of all, let us discuss the reasons behind the outbreak of the peasant and tribal uprisings. You know, promotion of British manufactured goods in Indian markets. After 1813, the Indian markets began to be filled with British manufactured products. These products were imported from Britain to India. As a result of the factory revolution, the number of factories increased in Britain, and these factory made goods were sold in India as one of its markets. And the Indian handloom industries could not compete with these British imported machine made goods, because since these were the machine made goods, the quality of these goods was high as well as the prices were low. But these Indian manufactured goods were handloom products. These handloom products could not compete with the Manchester made British goods, because since it was handloom goods, the price was high and the quality was also low compared to machine made goods imported from Britain. So, the traditional indigenous industries in India declined as a result of the import of the British made goods to India. And once the traditional indigenous industries declined, these weavers turned their attention to agriculture. Then transfer of wealth from India to Britain. In the previous lectures, we have discussed how the wealth of India drained to Britain through different channels. And what about the land revenue settlements of the British? The land tax was fixed high, and in addition to the high land tax, the zemindars, they were the revenue collectors. They also exploited the peasants in several ways. And if the peasants were not in a paid position. The land tax, due to crop failure, he was forced to borrow money from money lenders at exorbitant interest rates. These money lenders further exploited the peasants by charging exorbitant interest rate. For the Zemindars, the British and the money lenders exploited the peasants by imposing high land tax. The British exploited by collecting extra money rather than fixed by the British government as land tax. The Zemindars exploited the peasants. When the peasant was not able to pay land tax due to crop failure, he borrowed money from money lenders. The money lenders also exploited the peasants. And in addition to the peasants, whose life became miserable because of the British administration in India. In addition to that, it was during the period of the British, the lands possessed by the tribals began to be encroached. The customary rights which the tribals had been enjoying since long began to be encroached upon with the introduction of the British administration in India. These were the reasons behind tribal and peasant uprisings. And the British revenue administration extended over tribal areas. With the extension of the British administration over tribal areas, these tribal people lost their hold over the agricultural land. The proprietary rights on which they had been enjoying since long. With the extension of the British administration on tribal land, the tribal lost the ownership of the lands. The surplus money was taken away by the English East India Company in the form of tax. These tribals were also exploited by the money lenders by charging high interest rate. As you have been told earlier, because of the import of British manufactured goods, the traditional indigenous industries declined, because these weavers turned their attention to land. However, even though they turned their attention to land, there was no respite. Once they purchased land and started cultivation, they were forced to pay high amount of tax to the British government. When the Zemindars, money lenders were exploited the peasants, whether there was any relief to the peasants from the law and judiciary? No. The British legal system, police and the judiciary always there to protect the interest of the British, Zemindars and the money lenders. This legal system, nor the police nor the court did come to protect the interest of the peasants and the tribals. They only protected the interest of the landlords, merchants, money lenders, that is revenue collectors. They never tried to protect the interest of the peasants. In this background, because of the exploitation of these money lenders, Zemindars and the British, and the denial of the justice by the police, judiciary and the legal system, these peasants and tribals did not have any option other than to rise up in arms against these forces which made their life miserable. Which force did make their life miserable? The British administration, their agents, Zemindars and money lenders, the police system, the legal system and the judiciary. And there was a vicious circle. and this vicious circle made the life of the peasants miserable as well as the life of the tribals. So, in this background, these peasants and tribals did not have any option other than to rise up in arms. In this background, peasant and tribal uprisings broke out in India. It broke out in different parts of India in different times. Let us look at the major peasant and tribal uprisings broke out in India during this period. The first was Sannyasi rebellion. Sannyasi rebellion was broke out in Bengal. It commenced in 1763 and it was suppressed after a long years only in 1800. The sannyasis and fakirs, they were religious mendicants. The sannyasi rebellion broke out among them. The sannyasis owed their origin to the Advaita school of thought developed by Shankaracharya. But fakirs, they owed their origin to the Sufism, to the Sufi school of thought. Sufis were mystical orders. So, it consisted of both the Hindus as well as Islam. However, they were religious mendicants. They were originally peasants and cultivated lands in Bengal. But with the introduction of the new revenue settlements introduced by the British, they were evicted from land. And it was the eviction of the sannyasis and fakirs from the lands possessed by them resulted the sannyasi rebellion. The policies of the English East India Company in Bengal, which made the life of many people miserable. In addition to the peasants, as well as there were certain zemindars under the permanent land revenue system of settlement. Zemindars became the owners of the land. However, the zemindars were given the ownership of land if the zemindar failed to collect the land revenue from the peasants and pay to the British. His zemindari rights would be taken away by the British and would be auctioned to the highest bidder. But there were a number of dispossessed zemindars. Dispossessed zemindars means that those zemindars who lost ownership of land or the zemindari right because of the non-payment of the tax to the British. The zemindars had failed to collect land tax and pay to the British government. So, their zemindari rights were taken away by the British government. They came into known as dispossessed zemindars. Dispossessed zemindars. These dispossessed zemindars and other peasants community also joined with these sannyasis and fakirs against the British government in Bengal. They moved around different parts of Bengal and Bihar. Their main attention was directed towards the raiding of the property possessed by the English East India Company. They moved in a bands of 7 to 5,000. In 1763, they attacked Dhaka factory. Most of the time their method or the technique of attack was guerrilla technique. They used guerrilla technique against the British administration. The Great Famine of 1770. This famine visited Bengal in 1770. In this famine, it took a heavy toll of life. It affected 1/3 of the population in Bengal. The policies of the British government were one of the reasons behind the outbreak of this great famine in Bengal in 1770. So, because of the famine, the sannyasis and fakirs turned their attention towards the grain stocks where rice and wheat were stored, and they attacked the storehouses and collected these grains and distributed among them. In addition to the attacks on the storehouses of the English East India Company, they also directed their attack against the government officials. They were considered as the source of exploitation of these sannyasis and fakirs. They looted government treasuries, and after looting money from this treasury, they distributed it among the poor. They created an independent government in two places, in Bogra and Maimansingh. In these two places, they set up independent governments. No doubt, the sannyasi and fakir rebellions witnessed the equal participation of Hindus and Muslims. They fought against the British shoulder to shoulder without any communal divide. Who were the leaders of these sannyasi fakir rebellions of Bengal? Manju Shah, Musa Shah, Bhavani Padak, Devi Chowdharani, Soban Ali. They were the leaders of the sannyasi fakir rebellions. The leaders also came from both the religions, Hinduism and Islam. But by 1800, the Warren Hastings, Lord Cornwallis took effective measures against the suppression, because of the suppressive measures adopted by Warren Hastings and later by Cornwallis. This sannyasi rebellion was suppressed by 1800. However, sannyasi rebellion was the first organized rebellion of the peasants against the British administration in India. And during their rebellion, they only attacked the government properties, that is, the sources which made their life miserable. Who did make their life miserable? The British, the Semindars and money lenders. These evil forces made the life of the sannyasis and fakirs miserable. So they attacked only the property of the English East India Company as well as the Semindars and the money lenders. Now, the second peasant uprising which we are going to study is peasant uprising of Rangpur. It also broke out in Bengal in 1783. It made the life of the peasants miserable. What? The land revenue experiments. You now recall that two land revenue system settlements introduced by Warren Hastings. One, he introduced in 1772. In 1772, he introduced quinquennial settlement or a 5-year settlement, because it came into known as quinquennial settlement. Under this system of quinquennial settlement, Warren Hastings gave the right to collection of land revenue to the revenue contractors. They also came into known as revenue farmers. Revenue farmers. They leased out the right of collection of revenue from the peasants on contract, and this contract was given to those who had promised high amount of money. So, most of the time it was not possible for these revenue farmers or revenue contractors to collect these high amount of taxes from the peasants. Most of the time they found it difficult to collect land tax. In addition to this high amount of tax, these revenue collectors or revenue contractors or revenue farmers collected illegal demands both by the English East India Company officials as well as the revenue contractors. Even though in addition to the regular tax, the officials of the English East India Company as well as these revenue farmers or revenue contractors, these revenue contractors or revenue farmers whose duty was to collect land tax from the peasants and pay to the British. But in addition to the regular land tax, these revenue contractors or revenue farmers collected more money rather than the tax fixed from these peasants. Illegal demands were also made by the officials of the English East India Company. It made the life of the peasants in Rangpur and Dinajpur miserable. You hear the name of one of the revenue contractor. It was Devi Singh. He was the revenue contractor of Rangpur and Dinajpur. He got the right to collect land revenue from these places of Rangpur and Dinajpur, and he appointed, Devi Singh appointed subcontractors who had actually collected the land revenue from the peasants. Devi Singh created a reign of terror in these two districts of Rangpur and Dinajpur. These two districts belonged to northern Bengal. Taxes on zamindars, on the local zamindars, were also increased. These local zamindars who worked most of the time as subcontractors. Devi Singh was the revenue farmer or the revenue contractor. Below the revenue contractor, there were subcontractors. He was the revenue contractor. Devi Singh was the revenue contractor. Below the revenue contractors, there were subcontractors. Most of the time, zamindars, local zamindars, local zamindars functioned as the subcontractors. These subcontractors collected money from the peasants. This was the system of land tax collection introduced by Warren Hastings in Bengal through his quinquennial settlement or 5-year settlement, because this contract was given for a period of 5 years. That is why it came into known as quinquennial settlement. And this revenue contractor increased the collection of land tax on the zamindars. They worked as subcontractors. So the zamindars or the subcontractors did not have any option other than to increase the taxes collected from the peasants. So the entire burden fell on the peasants. And because of this increasing revenue demand of the revenue contractor, they have been seeing the peasants were not in a position to pay this high amount of tax. So when the peasants were not in a position to pay the high amount of tax, Singh and his men, they engaged in illegal practices of beating and flogging the peasants. This revenue contractor Singh and his agents engaged in the burning of the houses of the peasants and destroyed their crops. Not even women spared. In this background, the peasants appealed to the English East India Company to redress their grievances. But the English East India Company did not do anything. Singh was a close associate of Warren Hastings. And after bribing Warren Hastings, Singh took the contract of these 2 districts. And so Warren Hastings sided with Singh, and no action was taken against Singh and his agents. In this background, these peasants did not have any option other than the protest. Nuruddin and Dayaram Seal, as in the case of the Sannyasi Fakir rebellions, both the Hindus and Muslims fought together against these evil practices of the revenue contractors. Revenue contractor Singh. They were the Nuruddin and Dayaram Seal provided leadership to this movement. They attacked houses, crops of the local agents of the contractors. These most of the time zamindars served as the local agents. These local agents collected extra money from the peasants. When the peasants rose in revolt, they began to attack the houses and the crops of the local agents of the contractors. Government officials were also targeted by these peasants who rose in arms. And they formed a government of their own in these 2 districts of Dinajpur and Rangpur. They stopped the payment of tax to the existing government. They collected only insurrection charges to meet the expenses of the rebellion from these 2 districts. The peasants stopped the payment of taxes to the revenue contractor, and only insurrection charges were collected by the rebellious peasants from these peasants to meet the expenses of rebellion. As told earlier, both Hindus and Muslims fought together, shoulder to shoulder, against the forces of their misery. But because of the superior military, the British was able to suppress this rebellion. Nuruddin was seriously injured. Dayaram Seal was captured and killed. In addition to these leaders, hundreds of rebels were also killed by the British. Following which a commission was appointed by Warren Hastings. This commission came into known as Peterson Commission. This Peterson Commission inquired the causes of the rise of this rebellion in these two districts. This Peterson Commission found that it was because of the excess of Devi Singh, the peasants rose in revolt. But Devi Singh was a close associate of Warren Hastings, and by bribing Warren Hastings, Devi Singh got the right of collection of land revenue as revenue farmer or revenue contractor. In this background, Warren Hastings supported the claims of Devi Singh, and Warren Hastings appointed another commission to inquire into the causes of the rebellion of the peasants in these two districts. Now we are going to see another uprising. It was Bill's uprising. It was from 1818 to 1831. The Bills, it was a tribal uprising. The two uprisings which have just studied were peasant uprisings. Now the tribal uprising, Bill's uprising. The Bills, they were the settlers of the Khandesh. They were tribal people. The British occupied Khandesh in 1818. It brought conflict between British and the Bills who had settled in Khandesh. This tribal population was suspicious about the incursion of the British in their territory, which had traditionally been belonged to these Bills tribal population. Trimbagaji, he was the minister of Peshwa Bajirao II. Bajirao, he was the last Peshwa. In 1818, Peshwaship was abolished by the British government. Lord Hastings, who defeated the Marathas in the third round of struggle, and Peshwaship was abolished. While abolishing the Peshwaship, Bajirao II was the Peshwa. Trimbagaji was the minister of last Peshwa, Bajirao II. The British believed that it was Peshwa and Trimbagaji instigated the Bills against the British occupation of Khandesh. The British thought that the Peshwa and his minister were behind the outbreak of the Bills uprising against the British. General instruction occurred in 1819, but the Hastings government, it was during this period of Lord Hastings as the Governor General, he was able to effectively suppress the uprisings of the Bills in Western India by using superior military force. However, it was suppressed. These bills rose up in arms again against the British under the leadership of Swayam in 1825. But this uprising, the second uprising of the bills, was also effectively suppressed by the British. It was because of the occupation of the bills territories by the outsiders which resulted the outbreak of the Bills rebellion. Now, the next rebellion at Mysore, it was a peasant rebellion. It occurred in 1830-31. As you recall that in the fourth round of struggle between Tipu Sultan and the British, Tipu Sultan was killed in 1799. In the fourth Anglo-Mysore War, it took place during the period of the Lord Wellesley. He was an imperialist par excellence. He wanted either to tame Tipu or to annex his territories to the British Empire. And in this war, Tipu was defeated, and after the defeat of the Tipu, and he was killed while heroically fighting against the British at Srirangapattam. After the death of Tipu Sultan, this Mysore was restored to the Hindu Odayar ruling family, from which Tipu's father Hyder Ali had occupied the administration of Mysore. So now the British restored Mysore to the Hindu Odayar family. And in 1799, after the restoration of this Mysore to the Hindu Odayar family, subsidiary alliance was also imposed. You know, subsidiary alliance, for the protection of this state, the British would provide military, and this Indian state was required to meet the expenses of the military. The army of the Indian states was disbanded, and a British resident would be stationed at the capital of the Indian state. And because of this, the Raja was to meet the annual payment for the maintenance of the troops. These troops were maintained at high cost. So the heavy demands of money by the British to meet the expenses of the maintenance of troops forced the Raja to increase the revenue demands from the Zemindars, who were the revenue collectors. When the Raja increased the revenue on the Zemindars, in turn the Zemindars were required to collect more taxes from the actual cultivators. The entire burden actually finally fell on these cultivators. In addition to this high amount of tax to be paid by the cultivator for meeting the increasing demand of the English East India Company for the maintenance of troops in Mysore, the situation was further aggravated by the corruption and the extortion of local officials. the zamindars used to collect more money rather than fixed as tax. It increased the miseries of the peasants. It was because of the high amount of money by the English East India Company, the situation turned violent. The peasants broke out in revolt in Nagar, one of the 4 divisions of Mysore. But even though it was broke out initially only in one of the provinces, it is soon spread to other parts of the province, other provinces, and peasants mobilized in large numbers against the British as well as the Mysore ruler. Sardar Malla was the leader of the peasant uprising in Mysore. They defied the authority of the Mysorean ruler. But it was during the period of Lord William Bentinck, this peasant uprising broke out. The British superior military force was sent by William Bentinck, and the superior military force suppressed these uprisings of the peasants in Nagar, and the British took control of this province. Following these uprisings of the peasants in Mysore, William Bentinck annexed Mysore to English East India Company in 1831. Thus, the administration of Mysore was passed into the hands of the English East India Company. Now the next uprising, it was called Uprising. It broke out during the period between 1831-32. The calls, they were the tribals of the Singhbum. It was a tribal uprising. They had been enjoying independent power under their chiefs. They had earlier resisted all attempts made by outsiders to establish their control in the tribal belt of Singhbum. The earlier effort was made by the Raja of Chota Nagpur, Mayurbhanj. These Rajas made efforts to bring these called tribals and their territories under the control, but these called tribals strongly resisted the attempts made by the Raja of Chota Nagpur as well as the Mayurbhanj to bring the calls under their control. But the British was able to establish their control in this area, even though they had earlier resisted the attempts made by Raja of Chota Nagpur and Mayurbhanj. The Khans were not able to resist effectively British because of their superior military. Singhbum was occupied by the British. With the occupation of the British, many outsiders also came to Singhbum. With this, the tribal lands went into the hands of the outsiders. Who were the outsiders? Merchants, money lenders, and the British. And not only their lands passed into outsiders like money lenders, semindars or merchants, Singhavam was also began to be administered by British law. Earlier, they enjoyed independent authority under their chiefs. Now, their lands passed into the hands of the outsiders like semindars, merchants, and money lenders, and they began to be administered by British law. Tribal chiefs considered it as a great threat to them, and this was the background behind the outbreak of these popular uprisings. These popular uprisings was directed against these outsiders who had occupied the tribal area. Soon rebellions broke out in Ranchi, Kasirabad, Palamau, Singhavam, and Manvam. In these areas, this tribal uprising broke out. They began to attack the outside settlers. Their houses were attacked and burnt, and these tribals looted their property. However, like other uprisings, the British was able to effectively suppress this insurrection as well. This insurrection was also ruthlessly suppressed by the British with iron hand. The next, Farisi disturbances. Farisi disturbances was between 1838 and 1851. This sect was created by Farisi sect was created by Haji Shariatullah of Faridpur. He was the creator of the sect. This sect fought against the British rulers as well as the landlords. Dadu Mian, who provided the leadership to the Farisi disturbances, he was the son of the founder Haji Shariatullah. These Farisi set up parallel administration in some parts of eastern Bengal. They established village courts to settle the disputes among the peasants in the village itself. They also protect the cultivators from the excess revenue demands made by the semindars and asked the peasants not to pay taxes to the semindars. They raided semindars' houses. They banned indigo factory. Indigo cultivation had been started extensively here, but the forces of the government and the armed retainers of the semindars crushed this movement. Dadu Mian was captured and he was imprisoned. The next movement was Mappila uprisings of the Malabar region. The Mappilas were the descendants of the Arab settlers as well as converted Hindus. They locally named as Mappilas. They were Muslim converts. In Malabar, where the landowners were the upper caste Hindus like Nayars and Nambiyars. they played the role of Semintars in Malabar. These Nayars and Nambiars were the landowners, and on whose land these majority of the Mappilas cultivated as tenants. They were cultivating tenants. They did not enjoy ownership of the land. The ownership of the land was vested with the upper caste Hindus like Nayars and Nambiyars in this area. But the Mappila Muslims were the cultivating class. These Mappila Muslims did not enjoy ownership of land. They were mere tenants. They could be evicted at any point of time by the landowning community of the Nayars and Nambiyars. And in 1792, British occupied Malabar through the Treaty of Srirangapattam. From Tipu Sultan. In the third round of struggle between Tipu Sultan and the British defeated Tipu Sultan and signed the Treaty of Srirangapattam. Under this Treaty of Srirangapattam, Malabar was brought under the control of the British from Tipu. Earlier, it had been under the control of Tipu Sultan. By the Treaty of Srirangapattam signed between Tipu and the British, Malabar was brought under British control. This was the condition in Malabar. These cultivating Muslim tenants faced over-assessment of tax, illegal taxes, eviction from land. They could be evicted at any point of time. They did not enjoy ownership of land. It was vested with the upper caste Hindus of Nayars and Namboodiris. Hostile attitude of the government officials. These were the reasons behind the uprisings of the Mappila Muslims in Malabar. They attacked both the Britishers as well as the landlords, Nayars and Nambiyars, Namboodiris, who had formed the landowning community. They directed their attack against both these upper caste Hindus as well as the British. Between 1836 and 1854, there were about 23 uprisings in Malabar. They attacked these upper caste Hindus, and British wanted to consider it was a communal struggle between Hindus and Muslims, because the cultivating tenants belonged to Muslims, the landowners were the upper caste Hindus. The British, with an iron hand, suppressed these uprisings. However, it is suppressed by the British. Again, it continued for another 50 years. Another rebellion was Sandal uprisings. It was broke out in 1855-56. They were the inhabitants of Birbhum, Bangura, Murshidabad, Bhagalpur and Purnia of Bengal and Bihar. This area came into known as Daman-e-Kok or Sandal Fargana. These Sandals who cleared the forest and started cultivation in these areas. But the neighboring Rajas of Maheshpur and Pakkur leased out the Sandal villages to the Semindars and money lenders. So in this area of Sandals or Sandal Fargana, the outsiders began to occupy their lands. Money lenders and Semindars came into this land and began to occupy these lands. And once the zamindars, money lenders, and the British established there, they began to exploit these original cultivators of this Sandal Fargana. High interest rate was imposed from 50 to 500% for the loans taken by the Sandal peasants. And false measures at the out, false weights and measures were used by these outsiders, and it was against the operation of these money lenders, zamindars, and Britishers. Sandal uprisings broke out. Sittu and Kanu, they provided leadership to the Sandal uprisings. Their aim was to bring back the good old days. These uprisings were suppressed by the British. These are the questions. Thank you, dear students, for watching my class. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to this piece of literary snippet. We usually know William Shakespeare as the most revered figure in the history of English literature. But we often tend to forget that he has also been one of the most hated figures in literature. And here I'm not talking only about those boys and girls who have to memorize long sections from Macbeth or King Lear or Julius Caesar before they can go and sit for their school or college exams. But I'm also talking about people who are themselves quite famous authors. Tolstoy, for instance, considered the writings of Shakespeare to be, and I quote, crude, immoral, vulgar, and senseless. George Bernard Shaw absolutely loathed Shakespeare, as he did Homer. But perhaps no other criticism about Shakespeare is more damaging than the one which says that Shakespeare is a marvelous storyteller, provided someone has told him the story earlier. Now, this piece of criticism is particularly damaging because it is true. None of Shakespeare's plays contain any original story whatsoever. They are all written using pre-existing materials, pre-existing stories. Now, does that diminish the stature of Shakespeare as a dramatist? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. See you in the next episode of Literary Snippets.